Well, who are the evil banks? First of all, there's the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve System, what is it? It's a collection of all the biggest banks. It's America's federal banking system, a collection of banks created, of course, by Woodrow Wilson, so we would never, quote, have another financial crisis. Working out well, isn't it? A collection of banks. That's who the Fed is. We don't know which banks. We can't find out. Even though they're using our money, they're printing our money, they're tubing our system and our country, we don't even know who they are. You want to protest somebody? Protest the Fed. Now, who is the IMF? The IMF is even a bigger collection of banks. That's the International Monetary Fund. That's a collection of the banks, the biggest banks all around the globe. The ECB, that's the European Central Bank. That's a collection of banks in Europe. Okay, those are the evil banks. So the money is now sitting in reserves. In 2006, it was off the charts. In 2006, look at the red line is loans. Here's their reserve, off the charts. This is what they had, their baseline, and this is what they're loaning out. Notice they were loaning more than they had. Then we had to have it kind of in line. But now the loans are going down and the base is going up. Okay? That's ridiculous. Those are the reserves. The other line, the loans. The loans are still plummeting. The banks are paying themselves. They are stealing from you. How? Well, the Fed opened what's called the discount window. It used to be a window of shame, but we don't have any shame anymore. And it used to be a place where if you went to the discount window, it was a sign to the rest of the market you were going to collapse. Well, they opened the discount window for everybody. Come on in. And all the banks jumped in line to get a piece of the pie. Some of them didn't want a piece of the pie, but they were forced to take it by the Obama administration. Now, for anybody who's keeping score at home, that's your money. The Fed took it and gave it to the banks. Oh, and it doesn't stop there. Those banks then turned around and gave your money to a little collection of banks over in Europe. Yeah, same thing they did with TARP. For those of you keeping score at home, that's your money as well. For example, 87 banks benefited from U.S. aid to AIG. Out of those 87 banks, 43 of them were foreign banks. France and Germany were the biggest benefactors, but banks in Canada and Britain and the Netherlands and Denmark and Switzerland all benefited, even though America took all the risk. The CBO says the AIG bailout lost $36 billion. For those of you keeping score, that's your money. Well, it's happening again, because now the IMF, you know, the big collection of banks, is telling this collection of banks that this collection of banks needs more money. They pleaded with 187 member nations. They asked for 300 billion euros to bail out the EU. They bled their reserves, and now they need more money. Please, bank, give this bank some more money. Where's all this money coming from? You. You are witnessing the biggest heist of all time, and you're the victim. Every country in the world, in the Western world, is being robbed blind. But who is involved? Well, the big banks, the globalists, the UN, the IMF, the go-green freaks, the hippies, the radical leftists, they're all working the scam. But look how far these guys are ahead of the game. The Wall Street protests, it's the lefties that are protesting, right? The hippies. The hippies are protesting along with the unions. Okay, so we have the hippies tied directly to the unions. They're tied together, right? It was SEIU issuing the Workers of the World Unite rallying cry. It's SEIU's Andy Stern, who was the #1 visitor to the White House. Wait a minute. And it was Andy Stern's SEIU who's orchestrating the current unrest. So let me see if I have this right. The hippies and the unions are connected, but the unions and the politicians are also connected. That's weird. They say that the banks over here are robbing us. Except the guys who are doing this on the street are in bed with the politicians and George Soros. And the politicians are in bed with George Soros. Now, wait a minute, how is this working? That's strange, isn't it? It's fascinating to me. Fascinating that all of these people are in league with each other. Except you. Except you. Remember, George Soros is the Center for American Progress. We showed you earlier how he said that if you don't give a bailout to the European banks, it's too horrible to imagine. So let me ask Mr. Soros, who has imagined this scenario, to imagine it out loud. Because this guy is paying people in the media to discredit people like me who are saying you should prepare for tough times. He makes sure that I'm called a crackpot. And these guys do it too. But if it's too horrible to imagine, if it doesn't work out, well, Mr. Soros, why wouldn't you tell people to prepare? Because you're telling these guys to prepare, these guys are preparing, and that's what these guys are doing. By the way, side note on George Soros, do you know he made $7.8 billion more this year than he did last year? What? $7.8 billion? It's the largest 12-month gain made by anyone other than Mark Zuckerberg on the whole planet. $7.8 billion. Now, Mark Zuckerberg's the guy with Facebook. Now, I know what Facebook has done because everybody's doing revolution through Facebook. Everybody I know is on Facebook. Do you have a single device that George Soros has made? Do you? Because he's an investor. My gosh, I just realized that. He's an investor. We should listen to him. My gosh, with everybody else tubing, with everybody else that is struggling, he's gotten richer to the tune of $7.8 billion in the last 12 months. Do you think Obama's checked? Because I guarantee you George Soros is paying a lower rate than Warren Buffett's secretary. I'm just saying. And it wouldn't match Obama's rhetoric. The politicians' rhetoric doesn't match the rhetoric of the unions. And the unions don't match the hippies, and the hippies don't match Soros, and Soros Wall Street, does it? Or does it? One more thing here on Soros. How does a guy who says things would be unimaginable without bailouts get in bed with a guy who won't speak out about the bank protests? If he's so concerned about this guy, so concerned about it, why won't this guy, who's in bed with this guy, and both saying they're concerned about these guys, speak out against these guys? Or these guys, who are really only hurting you? Something's not right. So the question that really the press should ask the president is, Mr. President, what's the plan after a possible nightmarish collapse? What's the plan? The biggest scam in history, the biggest robbery in human history is happening right now. And if you're not aware, any direction you run into somebody who's causing the trouble intentionally. You run into a leftist, and that includes Barack Obama. Here's what really bothers me. If you check out what the Day of Rage protesters are planning on doing, this one is coming to L.A., taking the trash to the bank. The banks are foreclosing on neighborhoods and leaving blighted houses with trash belonging. We're going to collect all the trash from one of these L.A. houses and deliver it to the responsible bank. They're going to deliver trash. Now, does that sound familiar at all? SEIU's Stephen Lerner, his Justice for Janitors campaign, hit the streets in Texas back in 2008. Here it is. What did they do? They dumped trash in the street. In 2006, they did this to shut down all of the traffic. It wasn't real popular. Here is SEIU's Stephen Lerner talking about this just days ago.
We want in Houston is because through escalating activity, through a really smart campaign that won public support, but through sitting in again and again, by blocking the biggest streets, by bringing Houston to a standstill, we literally had a meeting with the biggest building owners and corporate guys, and they said, let's get this over, because this is not good for Houston. So I'm not talking about just randomly acting that when we escalate, when we build in, we can actually change people's behavior.
That's what's happening, gang. Been 188 days since we told you about Stephen Lerner, reported his own words that they were planning on making banks fall. He explicitly said he's trying to collapse the economy and Wall Street. We showed you how he encouraged people to break the law. What an amazing coincidence, because that's what's happening now. Protests went from no arrest to 80. It's like they're almost orchestrating it. Oh, they are. And the president continues to say nothing, continuing his long-standing tradition of, oh, and it's not so convenient. When it kind of fits my agenda, I'll just be quiet about it until it's too late. By the time the people are onto this robbery thing, the only movement out there, and it will make sense at the time, will be the hippies saying Wall Street stole from you. And the hippies will be right. Because these guys have all participated. But this one and this one aren't so obvious. These two are the ones who are providing the cover. So these guys can make their escape. The leaders orchestrating this whole protest are the ones who created the problem. And they're merely creating a diversion. So the question is, what do you do? Tonight, we give you some solutions. We give you some things I would like to ask you to do to get involved, to make a difference, to realize that you are no longer the majority viewpoint. You are no longer the primary culture. You are now the counterculture. Well, it is time you start acting like that. It's time that you start standing up for what you believe in. It is time for you to start standing up for America with more than just a sign.